Every time she tried to speak, something stopped her. A phone call that ended too fast. A meeting that got rescheduled at the last second. A witness who suddenly couldn't remember what they saw. It happened so many times, in so many different rooms, with so many different people, that Elena Voss stopped believing it was coincidence. She started believing it was design. And she was right. Until the day nothing could stop her, and the thing she unleashed didn't just end her silence. It ended careers, marriages, and the reputations of people who thought they were untouchable. This is a story about a woman who was quiet for 11 years, and what happened the moment she finally decided not to be. Elena wasn't the kind of person you'd expect to bring down an empire. She was 34, soft-spoken, the kind of woman who said thank you to waiters and remembered the names of everyone's kids. She worked as a compliance officer at Alderbrook Health Partners, a private hospital network that had built its reputation on a single word plastered across every billboard in 3 states: trust. She believed in that word. She had built her entire career around it. And for 11 years, she genuinely thought the people she worked with believed in it too. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday in March, when a routine audit crossed her desk. Nothing unusual, at first glance. Just a spreadsheet of incident reports from one of the network's rural clinics. But Elena had a habit her colleagues used to tease her about. She read everything twice. And the second time through, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. 3 patient deaths at the same clinic, in the same 8-month window, all logged under different codes, all filed by different supervisors, all quietly closed without a single follow-up investigation. On paper, it looked like nothing. In practice, it looked like someone had learned exactly how to make 3 deaths disappear into a system too large for anyone to notice. She almost let it go. That's the part people never expect when they hear stories like this. She almost closed the file and moved on with her Tuesday, because raising a flag inside a company like Alderbrook wasn't a small thing. It meant paperwork, meetings, scrutiny, and possibly making enemies of people who had spent decades building their careers inside those walls. But Elena had a rule she lived by, one her father had taught her when she was young enough to still believe rules like this were simple. If you see something and you say nothing, you didn't just witness it. You joined it. So she flagged the file. At first, nothing happened, and that felt like a small relief. Her supervisor, a calm and measured man named Gary Holt, thanked her for her diligence and told her he'd escalate it to the regional safety board. Elena believed him because she had no reason not to. She went home that night and told her husband, David, about it over dinner, the way she told him about everything. David nodded along, asked a few careful questions, told her she'd done the right thing. He always knew exactly what to say to make her feel steady. That was one of the reasons she'd married him. What she didn't know yet was that David worked in an entirely different building than the one he claimed to leave for every morning. 2 weeks later, Elena noticed the first real sign that something was wrong. The safety board never scheduled a meeting. When she asked Gary about it, he seemed surprised she was still thinking about it at all, as if the matter had quietly dissolved somewhere between his office and hers. She asked to see the follow-up report. There wasn't one. She asked who had reviewed the case. Nobody could give her a straight answer. It was as if the file had been swallowed by the building itself. This is where most people would have stopped. Elena almost did. But then something happened that changed the shape of everything. A nurse from that same rural clinic, a woman named Priya Desai, reached out to her privately, off the record, terrified enough that she asked Elena to meet her outside a coffee shop 2 towns over instead of anywhere near the hospital. Priya told her that all 3 of those deaths had one thing in common: understaffing. The clinic had been running on a skeleton crew for months, a cost-cutting decision made at the executive level, and every incident report that mentioned staffing shortages had been quietly edited before it reached the regional office. Someone was rewriting the story of what happened to those patients, in real time, one file at a time. Elena drove home that night with her hands shaking on the steering wheel. She had spent 11 years believing that the system she worked inside had flaws. Sure, every system does, but that it was fundamentally honest. That night she understood, for the first time, that the dishonesty wasn't a flaw. It was the architecture. She decided to go further up the chain. She requested a meeting with the network's chief operating officer, a polished, magnetic woman named Renata Cole, who had built her personal brand on words like transparency and accountability, words she used in interviews the way other people used punctuation. Elena walked into that meeting expecting to finally be heard. Instead, she was handed a folder and a smile. The folder contained a formal write-up, not about the deaths, about her. Insubordination, the folder claimed. Unauthorized contact with clinical staff outside her department. A pattern of what Renata called, without a hint of irony, disruptive behavior. Elena sat there stunned as the woman who had once called her a rising star in the company newsletter now spoke about her like a liability that needed managing. That was the moment the silencing truly began, though Elena wouldn't understand the full scope of it for months. It didn't come as one dramatic blow. It came as a slow, coordinated tightening, institution by institution, each one closing. A door she hadn't even realized was still open. Her formal complaint to HR vanished into a black hole of "we're looking into it." Her request to speak with the state medical board was quietly redirected to an intake line that never called back. When she tried to contact a local journalist who had once written a glowing piece about Alderbrook's community outreach program, the story mysteriously never ran, and the journalist stopped answering her emails within a week. Elena didn't know it yet, but that journalist's editor had taken a call from someone on Alderbrook's board the same afternoon her tip came in. And then there was David. At first, Elena thought her husband was simply preoccupied. He'd started working later, taking calls in the garage with the door shut, glancing at his phone every time it buzzed with an expression she couldn't quite name. She told herself it was stress. Everyone was stressed. She was the one going through something impossible, and she needed him to be steady, so she didn't push. That, she would later realize, was exactly what he was counting on. The truth came apart in pieces, the way truth usually does. A misdirected email. A comment from a coworker who assumed she already knew. A file left open on the shared family laptop that she wasn't looking for, and found anyway. David wasn't just distracted. He was employed, quietly and off the books of any public record, as a strategic communications consultant for Alderbrook's legal team. His job, in plain language, was risk management. And somewhere along the way, his wife had become one of the risks he was managing. Elena sat on the bathroom floor the night she understood this fully, replaying every conversation from the last 4 months, every reassuring word, every gentle suggestion to just let it go and focus on herself. Every time he talked her out of pushing harder. It hadn't been love steering those conversations. It had been strategy. She confronted him. He didn't deny it, not really. He used softer words instead, words like protecting you, and it's more complicated than you think, but underneath all of it was a simple, brutal fact. Her husband had chosen a paycheck and a corporation's reputation over her. He told her, almost gently, that if she kept pushing, there wouldn't just be professional consequences. There would be personal ones too. Custody of nothing, since they had no children, but reputation, friendships, the mutual social circle they'd built over 9 years of marriage. He wasn't threatening her, he said. He was warning her. It felt exactly the same either way. If David's betrayal was the wound, what came next was the infection. Elena's closest friend since college, a woman named Rachel Ferris who had stood beside her at her wedding, worked in public relations. Not for Alderbrook directly, but for a firm that Alderbrook had quietly retained the moment Elena's internal complaints started generating whispers. Rachel had spent the last 2 months meeting Elena for coffee, listening to every detail of what she was going through, offering comfort, offering advice, offering, it turned out, real-time intelligence to a firm that used it to draft a narrative discrediting her before she'd said a single public word. Elena found out about Rachel almost by accident, through a mutual friend who mentioned overhearing Rachel on a call describing Elena as, quote, a well-meaning woman who's clearly having a hard time processing some personal stress. That single sentence told Elena everything. Somewhere in a conference room she'd never seen, people were already building the story they'd used to explain her away. Grief, instability, overreaction, anything but the truth. Even her therapist, a woman she'd trusted with the most fragile parts of herself for 2 years, turned out to have a professional consulting arrangement with a law firm connected to Alderbrook's outside counsel, an arrangement disclosed in fine print Elena had never been shown. She never confirmed exactly what was shared from those sessions, and some part of her still hoped it was nothing. But by then, hope had become a luxury she could no longer afford to trust blindly. By late summer, Elena Voss had lost her job, her marriage, her best friend, and any illusion that the systems meant to protect people like her actually worked the way she'd been taught they did. HR had closed her file. The medical board had no record of receiving her complaint. The journalist had moved on to other stories. Her husband had moved into an apartment 2 miles away, and within a month, rumors began circulating that he wasn't living there alone. Every door she had knocked on had been quietly closed by someone who had gotten there first. She spent 3 weeks barely leaving her apartment. Anyone who has lived through a betrayal this layered knows there's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing the ground beneath you was never solid, that the people closest to you had been quietly serving someone else's interests the entire time. Elena wasn't just grieving a job or a marriage. She was grieving her own trust in her ability to tell who was safe. And then, on a rainy October night, her sister called. Elena and her sister Marissa hadn't spoken much in years, not out of any dramatic falling out, just the slow drift that happens between siblings who build separate lives in separate cities. Marissa worked in cybersecurity, a field Elena had always found a little mysterious and more than a little intimidating. She'd assumed, without ever really thinking about it, that Marissa's silence over the past few months meant she was too busy, too far away, too disconnected to know what was happening. She was wrong about that too, but in the one direction that finally worked in Elena's favor. Marissa had been watching everything unfold from a distance, piecing together fragments from mutual contacts, growing more suspicious by the week of how neatly and completely every one of Elena's attempts to speak up had been shut down. She recognized a pattern her sister hadn't been able to see from the inside, because Elena was too close to it, too exhausted, too busy trying to survive each individual betrayal to notice the coordinated shape of the whole thing. Marissa had spent those quiet months building something. Not a lawsuit. Not a formal complaint through channels that had already proven they could be closed, redirected, or quietly buried by a phone call from the right person. She had built a decentralized, encrypted publishing platform, something designed from the ground up so that no single company, law firm, editor, or board member could reach in and make it disappear. No centralized server to pressure. No editor to call. No account to suspend. Once something was published there, it existed in hundreds of independently hosted copies simultaneously, verified and timestamped in a way that made it essentially impossible to erase or dispute after the fact. She told Elena the truth in a way no one else had bothered to. Every institution you've gone to has a relationship with somebody. HR answers to legal. Legal answers to the board. The board has relationships with reporters, and reporters have editors who take calls from people with money. There's exactly one kind of platform they can't control, because it isn't built to be controlled by anyone. It's built to survive the people trying to erase it. For the first time in months, Elena felt something other than exhaustion. She felt the faint, dangerous shape of hope. But hope alone wasn't enough. She needed proof, real proof. Not just her own account of conversations and suspicions. She spent the next 6 weeks quietly rebuilding what the last year had taken from her, this time working entirely in secret. She reconnected with Priya, the nurse who had first warned her, and this time Priya was ready to go further, having watched 2 more incident reports quietly vanish since their last conversation. Priya helped her locate copies of the original, unedited incident logs, the ones filed before someone with editing access at the regional office had gone back and softened every mention of the staffing shortages. She found a second whistleblower inside the finance department, a quiet, methodical man named Owen Reyes who had noticed the same cost-cutting decisions from a different angle, tracking how executive bonuses had actually increased in the same quarters that clinical staffing had been slashed. Owen had never come forward because, like Elena, he'd watched what happened to the people who tried. Piece by piece, across 2 months of careful, exhausting work done mostly at night after her new part-time job at a diner, Elena assembled something the company couldn't spin away with a well-worded press release. Internal memos showing staffing cuts approved the same month as 3 preventable deaths. The original incident reports, before their language was softened. Financial records showing executive bonuses tied directly to those same cost-cutting decisions. And recordings, legally obtained in a state where one-party consent was enough, of 2 separate conversations in which Alderbrook representatives referenced managing her as a reputational risk rather than addressing the substance of what she'd found. The first twist came the night before she was ready to publish, when Renata Cole called her personally for the first time in months. Elena expected threats. Instead, she got an offer. A settlement, generous enough to make most people's hands shake just hearing the number, in exchange for a signature on an agreement that would make everything she knew legally unspeakable for the rest of her life. Renata's voice was warm, almost maternal, the same voice that had once called her a rising star. She told Elena this was her chance to finally move on, to stop fighting a battle she couldn't win, to take care of herself for once. Elena sat with the phone against her ear for a long moment, and for the first time in the entire ordeal, she understood something with total clarity. If they were offering her this much money to stay quiet, then what she had wasn't just true. It was catastrophic to them. The offer wasn't mercy. It was fear wearing a kind voice. She declined. The second twist arrived 2 days after the platform went live, when the story didn't just spread, it detonated. Because the platform Marissa had built didn't route through a single news outlet that could be pressured or slow-walked, the documents, the recordings, and Elena's full account appeared simultaneously across hundreds of independent nodes, shared and reshared faster than anyone at Alderbrook could formulate a response. Within 18 hours, it had been picked up by 3 major news organizations who could no longer credibly ignore it, precisely because it hadn't come from a single source they could quietly lean on. It had come from everywhere at once. That's when the second twist truly landed. Buried in the financial records Owen had helped compile was a detail nobody had focused on until independent researchers started combing through the public data. The consulting firm that had been paid to manage Alderbrook's reputational risk, the same firm employing both David and Rachel, was partially owned through a holding company connected to 2 members of Alderbrook's own board. The people supposedly hired from the outside to protect the company's image had actually been insiders all along, financially incentivized to make problems like Elena disappear, because every dollar spent suppressing the truth was a dollar that flowed back into their own pockets. David hadn't just chosen a paycheck over his wife. He'd chosen a paycheck that was quietly designed to reward the exact kind of silencing he'd helped orchestrate against her. The third twist came from a place Elena never expected. In the flood of messages that arrived after the story broke, one stood out. It was from Gary Holt, her old supervisor, the man who had told her he'd escalate her very first report all those months ago. Elena had assumed, understandably, that he'd been complicit from the start. His message told a different story. Gary had escalated the report exactly as promised, but somewhere between his desk and the safety board, it had been intercepted and buried, and when he tried to ask questions about it, he'd been quietly moved to a different division and warned, in no uncertain terms, that his own job depended on letting it go. He'd spent months carrying guilt he'd never told anyone about, afraid that speaking up would cost him everything and change nothing. Now that Elena's platform had made silence a more dangerous choice than honesty, he came forward with his own internal emails proving exactly when and how the report had disappeared, closing the last gap in the timeline, and making the cover-up impossible to explain away as a series of innocent mistakes. What followed moved faster than anyone at Alderbrook could control. State regulators, who had ignored Elena's original complaint for months, suddenly found themselves unable to ignore a story with a documented timeline, corroborating whistleblowers, and financial records verified by independent journalists. An emergency investigation was opened within days. Renata Cole resigned within 2 weeks, her resignation statement, full of the same polished language she'd once used to praise Elena, now repurposed to describe her own commitment to stepping aside for the good of the institution. The board members connected to the reputation management firm faced their own separate investigation for the financial conflict of interest, one that would eventually result in criminal charges related to fraud and obstruction. The consulting firm quietly dissolved within 4 months, and along with it went the careers of both David and Rachel, whose names appeared, in far less flattering language than they were used to, in nearly every article written about the scandal. Elena didn't gloat. That surprised people who followed the story, the ones expecting a triumphant final interview full of righteous anger. Instead, when a reporter finally sat down with her months later, what she talked about most wasn't David, or Rachel, or Renata. It was the 3 patients whose deaths had started all of it, and the families who finally received honest answers instead of carefully worded evasions. She talked about Priya and Owen and Gary, the people who had quietly carried pieces of the truth for months, terrified and alone, until they found each other and realized the silence had never actually protected anyone. It had only protected the people responsible. The clinic where it all began has since been fully restaffed, operating under new leadership and new oversight, with a family's advisory board that reviews safety incidents directly, no longer filtered through layers of executives with financial incentives to make problems disappear. Elena didn't return to her old career exactly as it was. Instead, she started something new, working with Marissa to help other whistleblowers document and preserve evidence the same uncontrollable way she had, building a small but growing network of people who understood, better than almost anyone, what it feels like when every door closes at once, and what it takes to build a door nobody else can shut. David reached out to her once, nearly a year later, with a message that started with "I know I don't deserve this," and ended with a request for forgiveness he never got an answer to. Elena didn't respond with anger. She simply didn't respond at all, and somehow that silence, chosen freely instead of forced on her, felt like the first real power she'd claimed in the entire ordeal. People often ask her, in interviews, in messages, in the comments sections of the platform that started it all, what kept her going through the months when every single person and institution she trusted seemed to be working against her. She always gives some version of the same answer. She wasn't trying to win. She was trying to make sure the truth existed somewhere that couldn't be erased. Winning, it turned out, was just what happened when the truth finally had nowhere left to hide. Every time she had tried to speak, something had stopped her, quietly, patiently, one relationship and one institution at a time, until there was almost nothing left standing between her and complete silence. But they made one mistake nobody warned them about. They forgot that a person who has been silenced enough times eventually stops looking for permission to speak and starts looking for a place where permission was never required in the first place. And once she found it, nothing they had, no title, no consulting firm, no carefully worded settlement offer, was ever going to be enough to make her quiet again.